Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Chicanery. Um, of course, it is your hostesses with the mostesses, Danny, and my fabulous co-host, JT.
Hello again.
Yes, so this weekend, or this past weekend, was the Las Vegas Grand Prix, and it was a lot. So this episode is going to be a little bit different than the typical race report style that we normally do. If you've been paying attention to either the Victory Lane Vibes Twitter account or my own, I have spent a lot of time and effort writing up a script that goes over basically everything that happened. But before we do that, I did want to jump into a kind of initial run through of the US Grand Prix because this level of dysfunction, for want of a better word, is not entirely unprecedented. Of course, you're familiar with street circuits, like Monaco, which has actually been on the calendar since 1950 and has existed as a Grand Prix circuit of some description even well before that. And then, of course, things like Albert Park, Singapore, Valencia, Baku, etc. So, first we're gonna have kind of a tour of the U.S. Grand Prix. So, of course, it started at Watkins Glen, which was the initial circuit. It was a mixed surface street course. It was 6.6 miles, and it was built in 1948. Constructed in 1948. However, because Grand Prix racing in its infancy was spooky. Uh, a child was killed because that's what happens at these things. um, in 1953, and it forced a sort of temporary. Well, that was what forced the permanent construction, which is effectively the Watkins Glen that we know today. However, there was a small temporary circuit that was all pavement. It was 4.4 miles. It was, in a lot of ways, it was kind of the prototypical modern street course. Lots of long straights, 90-degree corners, etc. Um, the permanent Watkins Glen circuit was built in 1956, which was modeled to vaguely look like the original circuit, though it was 2.3 miles and it was all tarmac. And that was what would host the United States Grand Prix starting in 1961. Um, and then in 1970, there was a complete track remodel. That's where you get like the boot section that we have now. And that's where Fast Bend and the 90 would look more or less like what they do today. Track length would go up to about 3.5 miles. And it became a real fan and driver favorite. It was um, it was very popular. It was the season finale, the autumn weather. It was a party. And then not only did you have F1, but NASCAR went to the circuit, SCCA, Can-Am, IMSA were all on the calendar. Now there was a chicane that was added to the S's circuit after Francois Sever and Helmuth Koenig were killed in 73 and 74 in the S's, respectively. But after Watkins Glen lost the race date, we it was removed. Um, and it is also worth noting that sort of the start of the decline of the circuit was probably in 75. The Canadian Grand Prix had been canceled because of a war between FISA and FOCA and the track organizers. And the track organizers actually showed up at Watkins Glen with basically the Canadian equivalent of a warrant to seize the prize money. And that plus the fact that fans were getting kind of unruly. The Bog, which is actually now the parking lot for Watkins Glen today, was a place where people were just burning shit. In fact, it was reported that they set a Greyhound bus on fire one year, which is just wild. But yeah, that, and then as a result of some of the upgrades, just the money defaulted, and that was actually what would end up happening in 19 1981, is just that the circuit defaulted on the prize money. They took out a loan to try to cover it, but it wasn't enough. But it's in all of the mess is where you get Long Beach. That's where Long Beach came from. FISA and actually Bernie Eccleston by this point, with the promotion sites, kind of saw the writing on the wall, and that's where U.S. Grand Prix West at Grand Prix at Long Beach, sorry, came from, and it was a companion event, and also it was lined up as a potential replacement, and that started in '76, and it ran alongside Detroit in 1982, but would fall off the calendar the following year. And then of course you get into the revolving door of USGPs. But part of why I mention all of that was because there was a tweet talking about how Las Vegas was the first street race. And I do believe your tweet was, and I quote, very loud, incorrect buzzer noise, because that just wasn't correct.
I think it was an article actually. They had written an article about it, and then I guess in the article, when you went and looked at it, they later were like, "Oh, this has since been corrected," and their correction wasn't actually correct. They literally just correct with very large air quotes and put in something else, more information that was also wrong. And then eventually it got community noted, and the community note was correct, but I don't know. It's just really funny because it like 5 minutes worth of research would have saved them the trouble and not looked stupid if they had just done that. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's worth noting my attention was well and truly on getting this monster done, so I didn't pay attention to quite as much of the aftermath, but it was just very stupid. And yes, 5 minutes worth of research would have absolutely saved them the trouble. But but of course, after Watkins Glen was the original Las Vegas Grand Prix, U.S. Grand Prix at Caesar's Palace. Now, it is worth noting that there were no permanent circuits in Las Vegas at the time. You had the Stardust. I always want to think of Stardew Valley. I always say Stardew, but the Stardust International Raceway, which is what is now considered Spring Valley, just outside of the city, and that had hosted Can-Am and SCCA racing. But that got knocked down in 1970, although the drag strip that was there actually survived for a few more years after that. Um, and so there really wasn't a whole lot. There was some interest in running it there, but of course, the track got knocked down. Some reports that I'd read, even from period sort of Formula One media, suggest that they had wanted to run a race in Las Vegas sooner than the first race in 1981. But I couldn't find anything as to why exactly that didn't happen. I don't know if the demolition of a Stardust, that's gonna get me every single time, is the reason why, or if it's something else, but just something worth noted. And it's also worth noting that Las Vegas Motor Speedway didn't exist at this time either. That wouldn't come for another little while after that. But the idea of the Caesar's Palace Grand Prix is that it was meant to take place a week after Watkins Glen. Um, but as a result of Watkins Glen unexpectedly falling off the calendar, it got pressed into, basically that time slot. So the original circuit was it was 2.26 miles, so 2.25 mile, and it was 14 turns. And as perhaps the name suggests, it was located in the parking lot of the Caesar's Palace Hotel, which is just ridiculous. And of course, and if you're familiar with Las Vegas geography, it was where the old strip was, so a little bit further northwest than where the current one is now. It was constructed in all of 45 days, at a cost of about $7 million in period, so that's a little over $20 million today. But it only actually lasted a couple years. It was 81 and 82. And then IndyCar, or CART at the time, assumed control of the race in 83 and 84. And they basically just turned it into I want to say an oval, but really it was like a square. It was a square. It had no banking. It was very, very weird. But I find this kind of interesting because it's sort of the rather haphazard nature of the construction of the original circuit in a lot of ways mirrors what we dealt with with the construction of this race. And I think that's worth pointing out. Um, and this circuit was truly kind of prototypical at the time because it was a counterclockwise circuit, which didn't really exist at all at that period. And it did a real number, particularly on the drivers' necks, and then being held during the daytime, it was hot. Um, Nelson Piquet, who won the championship at Vegas or Caesar's Palace, more accurately, in 81, needed 15 minutes to recover. And of course, again, we don't have a video component, large air quotes there, from symptoms of mild heat exhaustion. But like I said, I find that all very curious because this feels almost eerily similar to sort of the issues dealt with this year. And curiously enough, F1, they didn't publish any attendance figures for either years, but again, period reporting that I found suggested that it was very low, even though the grandstand area was able to accommodate 45,000 people. Now, KTNV, which is the NBC affiliate in the Las Vegas area, their reports from 83 said that the kart race had an estimated 40,000 people on race day. Again, no exact figures. And it's worth noting that entry was free. And, for a little bit of further context, the 1981 race was actually a huge loss for Caesar's Palace. But I find all of this kind of ironic because it's worth noting that Formula One and Caesar's Palace, they had huge aspirations sort of for this event. It was October 2nd of 1980. And I promise we are not pivoting into a boxing podcast, but I promise this is, for context sake, this is kind of important. But again, if you do pay attention to stuff, that was the last hurrah. That was Larry Holmes versus Muhammad Ali. That was also held at Caesar's Palace, at a sort of temporary venue constructed in the vicinity. And the live gate was $6 million, and the stands that were created were capable of holding nearly 25,000 people. It was like 24,700, if I remember that correctly. Now, it's worth noting that afterwards, the reputation of the fight would kind of sour because, well, Muhammad Ali was getting old in 1980. That was not the same fighter that we had in, the 60s and 70s. But also, some information would be published later that, sort of there was neurological degeneration as a result of, well, Muhammad getting hit in the head constantly. He was almost not medically cleared for the fight. As a direct result of which. And so, certainly in the context of 2023, this fight was pretty shit. But at the time, it actually was a commercial success. And that was what spurred sort of Caesar's Palace and, the Formula One group, Formula One media, to hold a event at the Caesar's Palace. But that wouldn't happen again. And like I said earlier, rolling street circuits. Detroit was 82 to 88 with Long Beach as a companion in 83. Then you had Dallas in 84, but some squabbling with Formula One and City Council. Dallas City Council would mean that the 1985 event was never held. And this was also as a secondary companion event. And then Phoenix was 89 to 91. And after that, until Indianapolis in 2000, there were no Las Vegas GPs. And part of that was because Tony George really sweetened the deal to get Formula One media and to get the FIA to Indy. And that was where we got the construction of, what is now called the Indy Road Course, was Formula One in 2000. So, a good bit of backstory, a good bit of context. But like I said, given even just the lighter reporting at the time, particularly of the mess, the quagmire that Watkins Glen turned into, and then just the complete financial disaster that was the Caesar's Palace Grand Prix, that kind of sets the stage for where we would end up now. So it was March 31st, 2022, when Formula One announced the return to the streets of Las Vegas. Um, you know, there are lots of similarities between, certainly in kind of basic structure, between Las Vegas, or the Caesars Palace Grand Prix circuit and the new Las Vegas Grand Prix circuit. Both counterclockwise. Granted, that's a lot more common now. However, very, very funny, and I don't know if this was intentionally or not, but turns 1 through 4 at the new circuit actually took place in a parking lot, which is, I think, just a funny little tidbit. But then, you run through the parking lot, that's on the corner of Harmon and Koval. And then, you've got a straight, and then you run around the sphere, and then you head around the sphere onto Sands, and then basically that gentle turn 12, 13 area, that's the strip where those cars were going very quickly, and that's before the circuit loops back in on itself at around Harmon and Koval. But the big thing that I find to be curious about this is that normally in Formula One, when they have a city or a circuit in mind, usually they work with local organizers and promoters. That's how they do this. They didn't do that for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. The entire running of that race was almost entirely under the purview of Formula One group themselves, which is interesting because I think that epitomizes a lot of the pitfalls, and especially with not really understanding how anything in Las Vegas works ostensibly. I think a lot of that can be down to not really having a good local liaison. I know there's Renee Wilm, who's the who's the CEO of the Vegas circuit, but I'm not really sure he counts, if I'm being perfectly honest. But anyway, between infrastructure and track construction, because it's worth noting that Formula One actually has a permanent facility now in Las Vegas, and that was where a lot of the money came from. That was responsible for $240 million worth of construction. The projected spend was about $500 million. I don't know what the final number was. The last thing I saw was in September. The build cost had reached about 435 million, which means that the 500 mil number does track. And the idea that was part of, this was the big initial investment, and the race would recoup those costs over the next decade, because Formula One says that I think there actually is a contract in place that runs this race until 2033, which is, these long-term deals are just absurd, but that's what they were going for. But it was broadly accepted that costs next year shouldn't get anywhere near this. But interestingly enough, Greg Maffei, who is the current president and CEO of Liberty, says that the build-out costs still seem to exceed even what they were projecting internally. So I don't know. So, well, that implies to me that they ended up spending more than the projected $500 million number. Granted, I don't know if that number that's floated, if that actually came from the horse's mouth, or if that's been, some combination of broader F1 media and local media. That's heretofore unclear to me. But it is something certainly worth noting. But he, like I said, he was on an earnings call with the Formula One group, and he noted just that he said, I think these revenue numbers are still approaching a reasonable estimate on profitability. Seems some one-time and startup costs that may have been larger than anticipated, but remembering how this is impactful to us, not only directly but indirectly. This is a very profitable race for us. Once we get past some of these initial startup costs, it will increase. Let's be clear, this year, we optimize for, being there, being on time, having a great race. That's not to say we won't have some of those, objectives next year. And then that's in reference to just trimming costs for this event generally. But I think we'll be able to optimize on other variables as well to increase profitability. And that's effectively businessmen speak for, holy shit, this is expensive. We'll figure out how to trim this next year. But I do think it's indicative of kind of just, basically kind of fuck it, we ball attitude that's been pretty evident since the announcement of the race. It's was worth it's worth noting that certainly when the times for the race were announced, I mean there was all manner of confusion and derision from fans, particularly in here in the United States, about how on earth are you going to have an American race and then have it at times that are so utterly inhospitable to most of the country. So, but speaking of which, so I remember grumping about it quite significantly. But I'm curious to know what did you think about the race times when that was announced?
I mean, personally, I didn't like it at all just because on the East Coast it's very late. Like the only thing like I didn't really watch a lot of the stuff that occurred during the weekend just because for one, like I know like free practice won and that obviously yeah, the stuff that happened with that happened and that was very late also. That was like 11 p.m. my time. And a lot of it I didn't end up watching just because it was very late at night at a time where like I had to like get up and like work. So I mostly kind of just skipped over it. I kind of thought some of the times where I'm like, I mean, I get it, like Las Vegas is a night city and most of the stuff people do, like most of the activities and everything is based around like nighttime and all that stuff. However, I'm just like, I don't really know about these times. Like, they honestly could do it at like 8 p.m., 8 or 9 p.m., and be fine. Which, I mean, 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern time, I don't know, might be still a little bit light outside just because I don't think Las Vegas or like that area of the country does daylight savings time. I don't recall, but I feel like even like, I feel like at that time it would be okay. Like, that's reasonable to me. But like 11 p.m. practices and then even like 2 in the morning having some of the practices, like I think free practice 2 was at like 2 or 3 in the morning or something like that. It's like, no, I'm not watching that.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. I well, you guys saw me very much tweeting through it with the race stuff because I did stay up for most of this because I had already kind of committed to broader Las Vegas storyline. But yes, certainly for East Coast time, it was absolutely inhospitable, and kind of everybody pointed that out from the very beginning. Honestly, unless you live on a Hawaiian Aleutian time, there really wasn't the way that that was scheduled. There wasn't going to be a time where that was really sensible. Now, I mean, I still, had work and all that stuff. So I still got up, plenty early and I just kind of made it work. It's one of the benefits of, having a coffee shop. Well, you can drink plenty of coffee through the morning, but it was kind of a mess. Um, However, but I think it really starts to give the game away a little bit because, like I said, despite, Formula One Group and Liberty Media and all of their highly concerted efforts at, talking about, basically pitching kind of Miami and Las Vegas as, they're these companion events to the US Grand Prix, and they are, we're broadening our American audience and, the stuff that they have been saying for a while now, honestly. In this instance, I feel like that is moderately disingenuous. Sure, it might be pitched to, American fans, but ones with, deep enough pockets to, go to Las Vegas weekend, and we will get to that in a second. Um, but that was what they wanted. They want didn't care about sort of the average, the typical F1 fan and attendee, and feel free to correct me if you feel like I am off base on that. But, this was meant to be just a glitzy, glamorous event, really just for Europe, kind of like Monaco, but just instead in, the middle of the American desert.
I mean, I think so. And then even like, I don't know. I think if you're speaking like in terms of like race product, I think maybe Vegas is a lot better, like produces a lot better racing than Miami does. Because honestly, I don't consider Miami to be that interesting of a race. At least the past few times they did it, I considered it to be very lackluster, not really worth anything. honestly, I had gripes with Miami for multiple different reasons. I mean, one of them being the race product just not being that good. Another of them being like the fact that they also had a lot of issues with like um clashing with locals. A lot of people who lived in the area also weren't really feeling it. Same with Las Vegas. However, I think that F1 pretty much just like ignored them. And like I think the community that lives around Miami, I think it might have been Miami Gardens specifically, like is mainly made up of like black and brown people. So like to me, like I don't particularly care for the racing venue. I mean, you could bring up the fact that they're selling like food for $20, like these mid-ass like Wagyu sandwiches. Somebody posted talking about, oh, it's $20, it's horrible. It's like, well, I don't really feel bad that you got scammed, and because why are you paying $20 for a sandwich anyways? But that's besides the point. I kind of felt like they kind of, in a way, ignored some of their concerns, and part of it being might because they are like it is a minority community. I mean, I know at least it says on here that that they issued an apology because all the locals didn't like the GP, and they kind of did nothing of the sort with Miami, even though an apology probably doesn't even mean much from them since they're doing it anyways and have a long contract for the race well into like a few years from now. So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you brought that up. I was talking to somebody while I was doing the research for this that, yes, this feels like a very similar brand of bullshit, frankly, that Miami was. And like I said, and I'm gonna get to that in a second because oh boy, is there a fair bit to be said about sort of initial venue prices and so on and so forth. But yeah, it was the same mess, and it feels like Las Vegas in terms of it is attempting to offer. It feels like it's very, very similar to kind of what we saw and dealt with Miami. Last year and even to a lesser extent, even this year. But and like I said, and I think that is truly important because even Stefano Domenicali, he issued a statement actually when the race times were announced in September of last year, late September last year, that the Las Vegas Grand Prix is, going to take, F1 weekends, to the next level, corporate nonsense if I've ever heard it. Staging a Grand Prix in the sports and entertainment capital of the world has allowed us to plan a truly spectacular celebration that has never been seen in our sport before, in the greatest arena on earth. I think I'm gonna barf. Uh, the entire city is, buzzing with excitement for next year's race. And well, that kids is what we call foreshadowing, because that is not how that went at all. But point is that this will be, the must be at event. Kind of the who's who, the keeping up with the Joneses of F1 races. Which, if you're getting to that point, then I would argue you already have a problem. But well, anyway. But yeah, but no, everybody was really feeling themselves with this race because ticket prices went live in oh goodness me, it went live actually shortly after the race was announced. It was mid August, and the MGM Grand Hotel pretty much immediately announced that they were buying up, something in the neighborhood of $25 million worth of tickets to create these, hotel and event bundles. Which I mean, granted, that is not unprecedented. You see that a lot when big entertainment um, venues when they come into town that the local hotels will buy up tickets to create these kind of
I mean, to be
all-inclusive
honest,
bundles.
with the price of the tickets, I feel like you could say they kind of jumped the gun a little bit because they set the prices astronomically high, and throughout the whole time, the months leading up to the race, they were really struggling to sell the tickets, and even at some point had to like lower the price a little bit. They kind of had to concede with that. I even saw like somebody posted like on Twitter that they were like selling the Las Vegas tickets at like Costco or something for like I don't know a few $100s or something. So, like, I don't know, the ticket prices, I feel like are just a whole 'nother, like, mess in itself.
Yeah, because, like I said, the aforementioned bundles, the MGM Grand was basically like, these are gonna be $100,000 potentially. The Wynn Las Vegas had basically had created a package that retailed at $1,000,000. And now granted, the idea was that, this was basically a tour of sort of the finest stuff that both, Las Vegas and even Formula One had to offer, as well as I think a lifetime membership to their sort of top rewards tier at the hotel. Now, granted, because numbers for all of this stuff were very difficult to tell or to find. I still think, from what I can tell, this is still a significant upcharge, and I don't know how many times you would have needed to stay at the Win to basically for that to pay for itself. I suspect a lot. And I did put out a bit of an APB on Twitter before the time of recording to see if anybody had actually bought this or if anybody knew of anything. Never heard back. I had assumed somebody had to, but that is just absolutely wild. Um, but yeah, but it's worth noting that even general admission tickets were for $500, and some of the grandstand seating stuff initially was like 2 grand. And yes, certainly to your point, in the weeks leading up to the event, prices had dropped considerably. Some of these packages and bundles had seen 50% price drop in some instances. Um, some of this is a combination of local apathy, and once again, we'll get to that in a second. Concerns about weather because the absolute luminaries at the FIA failed to consider that the desert gets very cold during the late fall, which is just insane to me. Um, and the fact that, it's just sort of a cause and effect, just exorbitant pricing meant that nobody was buying the tickets because it was too expensive. And then there's some other factors and ones that I actually hadn't initially considered. You know, the championship is done and dusted. There was a lot of people felt like there was little incentive. And also, well, Max Verstappen isn't very popular here in the United States either.
Them not knowing the weather forecast ahead of the Las Vegas race is kinda it's a bit ridiculous to me, considering the fact that, once again, 5-minute Google search could have easily told them what it was like. It's like now they do race in other countries that have desert climates, like Qatar is a desert climate, Bahrain, desert climate. However, it does get cold, at least in Vegas. I know in a lot of other desert states like Arizona, New Mexico, it does get cold because Lord and behold, they're at different like distances from the equator.
Hmm.
But I guess they failed to consider that.
Yeah, exactly. The funny thing is, according to some of the reports that were trickling out from the FIA in the, week leading up to the race, if anything, they thought that it was going to be the opposite problem, that they were going to have, Qatar level heat issues. I'm like, no. And granted, and it's one of those things. It's one of those things, when you talk about, book smart, but completely lacking any and all common sense because we already knew that Qatar was abnormally hot and humid. It is normally not that warm the time of the year that the race is held. It's normally not. So even as it was, even for Qatar, those weather conditions were a bit of an anomaly, concerned with the fact that it was a double header weekend just off the back of the Japanese Grand Prix. And as a result of the pretty ridiculous time change, and the fact that it seems like from what I understand, a number of the drivers got sick after the Japan weekend. So the fact that most of those drivers weren't even 100%. And it's the perfect confluence of circumstances to have, the exhaustion issues, the illness issues that we had after Qatar. But apparently somebody failed to consider that at some point, and I don't quite know why. But yes, it is all very, very silly. But just to properly convey the high levels of copium that Formula One was going through during this, even despite the fact that this race, even 3 or 4 weeks ago, was shaping up into be an absolute shitstorm. Stefano Domenicali, and it was this November 3rd's earning call that I've been referencing periodically, was insistent that this was going to be a sellout crowd. And I don't understand watching all of that. And, and look, I understand, fundamentally Formula One is a business. There are stakeholders. I understand that there's some level of appeasing them. But to sit and deny the obvious, and that is that there's a very high chance that this race could turn into an absolute mess, is is insane to me, honestly. Like, I don't get it at all. And to be fair, in some ways, particularly Liberty Media will walk that back a little bit because, again, Maffei issued an apology like the week of the race, basically apologizing to the Las Vegas residents and, basically appreciating their willingness to tolerate us. They've, talking, big revenue numbers. And again, we'll get to that later. But, hoping that this benefits Las Vegas and that, that this was going to be the most difficult year of construction. But it was entirely too late by this point. So the absolutely wonderful Elizabeth Blackstock, Formula One nerd, is a writer at Jalopnik, but also co-hosts the Donut Racing Show podcast, which is F1 driven, and also co-wrote a book with Alanis King Jones about Rich Energy that was published late last year. She interviewed a number of people who worked/lived in Las Vegas or, worked on the Strip, and even people who might have been vacationing. And oh boy, this is not good. A few folks expressed the sentiment that back in the days when the mob controlled event hosting in Las Vegas, that was preferable to the corporate partners now. Some folks reported even seeing cars on the Strip that had "fuck F1" written on the rear windshield. One woman, she was, dropping off a relative that works at the Mandalay Bay and said it took her like 80 minutes to get from her home basically to the Mandalay Bay Casino and Hotel. It was just an absolute mess. Somebody else who was vacationing in the area talked about, how it's just, was vacation, talked about how it's just completely ruined the area. And I will, so I guess this is actually as good a time as any to say I created a Substack to post some of this longer form content so it can be read in its entirety. It'll be in the description of this episode when it goes live as a way to read through it. I have all the links for everything I've talked about will be down below in effectively a sources page. It's quite a few. So if you want to go and read some of these pieces yourself, or just if you, frankly, want to check my sources, you can do that. But point being is that it was a mess. And sort of the common thread was it seemed to be a sort of a cocktail of kind of arrogance and ignorance from Liberty and Formula One, acting like they're doing basically the region a favor. But it's worth noting that the Las Vegas revenue, it looks less like city revenue, and it looks like the GDP of a small country. Las Vegas, the city of Las Vegas alone generated $8.3 billion in revenue in 2022. That is twice the GDP of Germany, almost. That was about $4 billion last year. Just so we're clear.
It's all the casinos and stuff, probably.
Exactly, because the casinos just along the Strip, so we're not even talking about the whole city of Las Vegas or the entire state of Nevada, made $814 million in December of 2022 alone, which marked actually an all-time record by quite a bit. It was like 25% or something silly. And, and of course, the ignorance part here is that they were completely deaf to just the challenges that, major construction like the new F1, the new Formula One, I think the Formula One arcade and that building, and then building the track, what that was going to do to the area and sort of the reputation that would sow with the locals. I think it is absolutely bananas. And the race weekend itself actually gets even more bananas. But we will talk about that a little bit in part 2. So, thank you very much for listening to this episode. And, well, it's all gas, no brakes next episode. So, thank you very much for listening. And, well, we'll catch you in the next one.